Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Um, as it's been pretty clear at this point, I did not make it back home on time for class. The good news is I had enough notice, so I was able to record, and I'm going to try to do it in a quicker manner than I do when we do it face to face at class. So grab your textbooks and let's get right to it, because it's really a good class with a very powerful lesson. And pardon the clear, because I'm reading the class off of a computer screen and not out of the book. Okay, so there's an old joke about a rabbi who has been tempted to eat pork. For years and years he's been told how wonderful pork is, and he's never succumbed to the temptation. So he finally says, you know what, it's time. I've been the rabbinate for so many years. And he goes and books a ticket to some remote island somewhere, and he checks into his hotel, and the first thing he does is he gets a seat at a fancy restaurant and orders himself, however it is, a big round of pork. Anyways, sure enough, as he's sitting down to go eat the pork, he sees that the pork is being delivered, as you see in the pictures, a full mini pig, and with the apple in the mouth. And sure enough, he hears from a distance, some people calling, "Rabbi, Rabbi." Turns out he sees it's a whole crew from his congregation, and suddenly he's so embarrassed and he's mortified. He feels terrible. And basically what happened was, they come over to him, they look at him, they see the rabbi, and they see the pig, and the rabbi says, "It's crazy, I just went to go order an apple, but in this island, I guess you order an apple, and this is how it comes." Anyways, the point is that we've been conditioned as a people that getting caught red-handed is perhaps one of the most embarrassing and uncomfortable things that we do. As such, we find that it's that we'll pretty much do anything to avoid being embarrassed, to the point that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the authors of the Mishnah, who's quoted in Pirkei Avot and Ethics of Our Fathers, he says, "May our fear of heaven be like the fear of flesh and blood," because we find that many a time we find ourselves in a situation that, because of the fact that there's people around, we don't succumb to whatever sin is tempting us at that particular time, and it's only because of the fact that there's people around that we withhold from sinning or whatnot, or we find ourselves motivated to go do the good deed that we would otherwise not necessarily have done, only because there's people around. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, if only our fear of God was like the fear of flesh and blood, it would save us from many, many a sin. So we know clearly that that's a concept. We find in this week's Torah portion a similar situation, where we have a person who is presented with the greatest of temptations, with the greatest of opportunities to sin, and there's literally and figuratively no one around. And the question is there's not a question, but the storyline is one of a difficult one. Where did he find the moral courage to withstand that test in that circumstance? The story in our parsha, briefly, is we know that Yosef, the famous Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers, he was sold to a caravan. The caravan sold him to another caravan, and they took him down to Egypt. For there he was sold as a slave into to be a slave. He was sold and he was bought by this individual by the name of Potiphar, who was a important officer in the government of Paro. And Potiphar had a wife who really took note of Yosef and wanted to be intimate with him, and she started this lengthy process of trying to seduce him in a way that in today's day and age, with all the scandals going on, would be quite unacceptable. So text number 1a reads as follows. Now it came to pass after these events that his master's wife lifted up her eyes to Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused, and he said to his master's wife, "Behold, with me my master knows nothing about anything in the house, and all he has given into my hand in this house There is no one greater than I, and he has not withheld anything from me except you, insofar as you are his wife. Now how can I commit this great evil and sin against God? Now it came about when she spoke to Joseph day in and day out that he did not obey her to lie beside her and to be with her. Okay. That's the Torah's poetic way of describing the fact that Yosef was basically saying to his master's wife that your husband entrusted me with everything, and he says, I am in charge and I can have access to do anything I want except for you. You're the only thing that's off limits, and therefore I'm not going to commit this sin, and I'm not going to be with you. So far so good. He's able to withstand her tricks. Well, she didn't give up so quickly. She tried day in, day out. Nothing was successful. One day there was an event. Different commentaries give different explanations as to what was going on that particular day. But what's relevant to our story is that no one was in the house. Everyone was either away at their temples praying or part of this particular event. And she comes over to Yosef once again to seduce him, and she physically tries to grab him. And the story continues as follows. Text 1b. And it came to pass on a certain day that he came to the house to do his work, and none of the people of the house were there in the house. She grabbed him by his garment, saying, Lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand, and he fled and went outside. Now it happened when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, that she called to the people of her house, and she spoke to them, saying, Look, he brought us a Hebrew man to mock us. He came to me to lie with me, but I called out loudly. And it happened that when he heard that I raised my voice and called out, he left his garment beside me, and he fled and went outside. So she left his garment beside her until his master came home. Basically, she tried to have her way with him. Yosef refused, not to be outdone and not to let the story come out in any other possible way. She waited over there yelling and screaming, holding Yosef's jacket, till then Yosef's master, her husband Potiphar, came home, and she showed Yosef's jacket as proof. You see, he tried to hurt me, tried to take advantage of me, but I fought him off, and I even managed to hold on to his jacket as he ran away. The way the story plays out, we know is that Yosef ends up being sent to prison, and he's there for 12 years, and ultimately that's what leads, Paro to have the dreams. Yosef, the dream interpreter, is called from prison, and that's what eventually leads him to become the viceroy of Egypt, and to save his brothers in famine, etc., which continues the story of the Torah. However, the question that's raised is, where did Yosef have that strength to withstand the wiles and the temptations that his master's wife was putting in front of him? The text number 2a, and it came about on a certain day that he came to the house to do his work, and none of the people of the house were there in the house. The sages debate the meaning of the words "to do his work." Some say that he came to perform his needs with her, and some say he came to perform his household duties. At least according to the first of the opinions, the fact that the sages say that in fact Yosef came home with every intention to go and commit a sin with her. He finally had said enough is enough. The temptation is so great, her seduction is so complete, and I'm going to go there. And he was heading to the house to go ahead and commit that sin. And so what happened? How come he didn't go ahead and commit the sin? Given the temptations, where did he find the moral courage to stand up to her and not commit the sin? So the Medrash continues, text 2b, and it says, Sharad musdiyukna shalaviv, he saw the image of his father's face. In other words, in the heat of the moment, this young boy, Yosef, because remember, he was only 17 or 18 at the time, he was about to cave in, and he saw some vision of his father Yaakov, and as soon as he saw his father Yaakov's face and remembered who he was, he suddenly realized that rather than commit the sin, he had to run away, and ultimately we know that he suffered the consequences for having that moral courage, but still he went ahead and did the right thing. So again, what gave him that strength to withstand the temptations that were set in front of him was the fact that he saw the image of his father. That's what helped. The question that's raised, and the Rebbe asks this question in the next text, is the term is that he saw the image of his father's face. Now, clearly what happened is the temptation was great, and Yosef felt that he needed to find strength to withstand that temptation. And He remembering his father's remembering who he was. His father's image is what gave him the strength to withstand that test. But the question is why does the Medrash have to say that he saw the image of his father's face? If it had simply said that he remembered his father, he remembered who he was, that would be enough to help him withstand the test. Why did he have to specifically have it? Why is the terminology that he saw the image of his father's face? As the Rebbe continues in text number 3, we need to understand why does the Medrash specifically stress that Yosef saw the image of his father's face? Why would it not have been enough to simply remember about his father, but rather he needed to actually see his face? Evidently, there was something in that Yosef saw in his father's face that was a deciding factor for him not to sin. So what did he see? Did Yaakov look angry? Did his father have like a scolding look? Was he begging him not to sin in that face vision that he saw of his father? So to appreciate this, we need to have a deeper study of both the dilemma that Yosef faced and what seeing his father Yaakov's face represented. Okay, in order to fully appreciate this, let's take a minute and put ourselves in Yosef's shoes for a minute. Here we have Yosef, 17-year-old boy, lonely, abandoned, rejected by his brothers, rejected by his family, not his father, but everyone else. His brothers sold him into slavery. He's alone. He's in Egypt. He's a foreigner. Maybe he knows the language. Maybe he doesn't know the language. And here he is. He's finally arisen to some sense of power, that even though it's a small sandbox, but it's the sandbox of his master Potiphar's house. And over here he finally gets to have some teeny bit of an identity. But essentially he's alone. People don't like to be alone. Loneliness is a very, very powerful and painful thing, to the point that when a person is alone, they will do virtually anything to end and reduce that loneliness. So here you have Potiphar's wife, his master's wife, a beautiful woman, who is tempting him and seducing him again and again, and pretty much doing, putting herself out there to him. And what is this? Why? Normally, in today's day and age, with all the scandals going on, it's shocking, because with all these scandals going on, it only highlights the problem. But most people either have just strong moral courage and won't commit the sin. But even people who are not full of strong moral courage, they realize that the price of their sin is so great that they won't do it. They will lose their wife, they'll lose their children, they'll lose their family, they'll lose their job. They realize that there's a very high price to pay for committing the sin, for succumbing to the temptation. In Yosef's position that he was in, there was no wife, there was no kids. Yes, he might possibly lose his job, but he didn't have much to start with, and he was starting at the bottom of the barrel, so he would just continue from that position of having nothing. Where did he find that power to overcome this temptation to not sin with his master's wife? That loneliness must have been so great, and there's really nothing stopping him. There's really, when a person is in such a state of loneliness, such a state of unhappiness, they'll do anything to end that incredible pain. And here she's offering him a end, or at least a respite from the pain that he's feeling. What was it about Yaakov's face that stopped him from committing that sin? Text number 4, the Talmud in Yuma says as follows. They said about Yosef, each day Potiphar's wife seduced him with words. Additionally, the clothes that she wore to entice him in the morning, she did not wear to entice him in the evening. The clothes that she wore to entice him in the evening, she did not wear to entice him in the morning of the next day. Basically, she changed her garments morning, evening. She use your imagination. She was as creative and as seductive as possible to try to get his attention. One day she said to him, "Submit to me and have relations with me." And he said to her, "No." So she said to him, "I will incarcerate you in prison." So he said to her, "I do not fear you," as it is stated in the verse from Psalms. He says, "God releases prisoners." So she said to him, "I will cause you to be bent over with suffering." So he responded again with another verse, "God straightens those who are bent over." She said, "I will blind your eyes." He says, "God opens the eyes of the blind." She gave him 1,000 talents of silver to submit to her, to lie with her and be with her, but he refused. So not only is the situation one where Yosef had to overcome his moral, his morality to not commit this sin, he had to he was literally being threatened with his life. So her seduction knew no end. Her threats knew no end. Normally you say you have something to lose. He had nothing to lose. So what stopped Yosef from doing this? Furthermore, and this is just an interesting parenthetical, but from a halachic perspective, Yosef may very well have had halachic grounds for which would have allowed him to sin with his master's wife. How is that so? So just to give you a little bit of a background, there's the laws that the Jewish people have, and for virtually all of the laws that a Jew has, if someone comes to you with a gun to your head and says, don't shake the lulav, or eat something that's not kosher, you're supposed to violate rather than lose your life. In other words, staying alive is more important than losing your life. The only exceptions to the rule is idol worship, adultery, and murder. That's for a Jew. However, for the seven Noahide, for the laws of the Gentiles, the seven Noahide laws, they do not have that same exception to the rule. In other words, they are supposed to keep their life alive. They're supposed to stay alive and violate pretty much anything in order to stay alive. They don't have that same exemption of those three laws that Jews have. As such, Yosef, who was in the category, the matriarchs and the patriarchs kept the Torah before it was given, including Yosef, but the fact is, until Sinai, they were Israelites and Hebrews, but more tribally, not halachically. And therefore, by law, if she was threatening to kill him, as we just read in this past text, he had, and so she basically was threatening to kill him. He had an obligation to not allow himself to be killed, and therefore, one can make a case that from a halachic perspective, he would have been allowed to sin with her in order to not violate, in order for him to not allow himself to be killed and actually stay alive under these circumstances. Again, this just highlights this idea. We find this an example of this idea from a famous story of Naaman, who was an officer in the Aramean army. He was a military commander, and it's a long story, but he lived in the time of the prophet Elisha, and he developed leprosy, and he bumped into Elisha, and Elisha counseled him to dip in a certain river, and after dipping the river, the leprosy would disappear, and he did it, and indeed that's what happened. The leprosy disappeared, and he was so moved and inspired by this miracle that took place for him that he essentially wanted to, if not convert to Judaism, he wanted to stop his idol-worshipping ways and recognize the God of the Jews. And however, he realized that if he went back home to the king and did not bow with his king at the time that they gathered at their particular times of bowing in the temple of Rimmon, the king would kill him. So he asked Elisha for guidance. So I'm going to slip back to text number 5. This is the source for this law.